Welcome to the third panel on academics and government. My name is Kathleen Hanley. I am the Bolton Perella Chair in Finance at Lehigh University. I have been in both academia and government. I served 3 times at the SEC and once at the Federal Reserve Board. Last time I had the longest title at the SEC, as did Scott Boggess. And if you were on the last panel, Chia Becker is the Chief Economist of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Deputy Director of the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, which is quite a mouthful. Today we have a very distinguished panel from a number of different individuals who have served in various capacities throughout the government, from the Office of Management and Budget to the SEC, OFR, and in standard setters like FASB. So we have a huge wealth of knowledge here, and I'm going to turn it over. We'll start with Mary Barth to do a short introduction of who they are, and they are all from distinguished universities, and some run centers. 2 of them, Russ and Debbie, run centers centered on policy issues. So we'd like to hear maybe how their government service helped with that a little bit later. So I'll turn it over to Mary and let you do a short introduction.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm Mary Barth. I'm a professor of accounting emerita at Stanford University. First of all, I want to take this opportunity to thank Scott for including accounting academics in today's event. There are a lot of economists out there, but we're happy to be here. And also, I've never really worked in government, but I've been actively involved in financial accounting standards throughout my career. I want to acknowledge upfront that my career journey is probably a bit different from many of yours, but hopefully my perspective is still helpful nonetheless. My involvement in accounting policymaking began long ago when I served on the San Francisco chapter of the California Society of CPAs Accounting Principles and Auditing Standards Committee. So long ago, I can't even remember when it was. We provided comments to the FASB on their proposals on behalf of our members. At the time, I was coming up to the ranks at Arthur Andersen and Company, a big accounting firm, and was looking for a way to contribute to my profession. Years later, I resigned from the Arthur Andersen Partnership to get a PhD so that I could become an academic and conduct research into issues of interest to accounting standard setters. Throughout my career, I've had lots of other engagement with standard setters, including the most amazing experience as being a member of the International Accounting Standards Board, and then as its academic advisor, and now as a trustee of the Financial Accounting Foundation, which oversees the FASB. How I got here and where I am is a lot less clear. I think playing a role in improving financial accounting reporting became my passion, even my hobby over the course of my career. And I followed that passion in my research, teaching, and service. My decision rule was simple. Whenever I had the opportunity to do what I love, I took advantage of it. And one thing led to another, and here I am. I had no grand plan. My approach worked out well for me, so I'm confident it will for you too. Just follow what you're interested in and all will be well. Kathleen?
Great, thank you, Mary. It's great to have you here. Larry, you want to do a short intro?
Sure. I'm Larry Harris. I hold the Fred B. Keenan Chair in Finance at the USC Marshall School of Business. My government service consisted of 2 stints at the SEC. The first one was immediately after the market crash of 1987, shows you how old I am, where I joined the SEC to do some research into what were the causes of that extraordinary volatility. I was brought in by the then chief economist Ken Lane, and I spent a lot of time working on market structure issues. It was an extraordinarily rewarding year, and one that I enjoyed quite a bit. I then, a few years later, from 2002 to 2004, I served as the chief economist of the commission, working for first Harvey Pitt as chairman, and then when Harvey stepped down, I then worked for Bill Donaldson. That time was also extraordinarily rewarding. As chief economist, I was then also head of the director of the Division of Economic Analysis, which has since been renamed. And the office, of course, has grown substantially since then, but I still had about 40 people working with me to advance public policy issues and to deal with various enforcement issues. I worked on lots of very, very interesting issues and a few that, that in retrospect probably didn't spend my time well on. But the really important stuff was market timing. That was the most important enforcement actions that I worked on. And I was largely responsible, along with my staff, for figuring out how to obtain the quantitative settlements that the SEC had against many money managers and market timers. Along with my staff, I was instrumental in seeing that the trace data became public. These are the bond trade prices. The bond dealers were working very hard to keep the information from being revealed to the public. As you can well imagine, that information in the hands of the public changes the balance of power between the bond dealers and their customers. I estimated, along with some colleagues, that the benefit to the public would be about $1 billion a year for trace, and probably about another billion as well for the MSRB data, a similar data project. And based on those results and many other inputs into the process, the trace data ultimately did become made public. And then finally, the other thing that I worked on that was extremely rewarding was Reg NMS, working with Annette Nazareth, who was then the director of the Division of Market Reg, another division whose name has recently changed. It's now called Trading and Markets. We specified the terms of Reg NMS, and that regulation was ultimately responsible for the complete switch of trading from inequities from floor-based trading to electronic trading. And with that, there's been a very substantial decrease in the cost of trading. Now, a little bit about how one should think about these things. I've told you that I had a part in all these things, and I did. But you have to remember that every success has many, many parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and godparents and so forth. So you definitely contribute, though I think that these projects would not have moved forward without the efforts of others, but I also believe that I was quite influential, and in many of these cases, they wouldn't have moved forward without my efforts. So it requires a lot of effort. And of course, government service involves a lot of negotiation, compromise, and maturity. So my advice, if you're considering going into it, is to go in recognizing that your job is just do the best you can, and that not to sulk when you lose, because your victories make it up.
Thank you, Larry. Debbie? You're muted.
Yes, I'm unmuted now, and hello, everyone. I think this should be okay now. I'm Deborah Lucas. I currently have the title of Sloan Distinguished Professor of Finance at MIT, and I'm the director of the MIT Golub Center for Finance and Policies. So I wanted to start by saying I think there's enormous opportunities inside government for financial economists to have a lot of value added. And something you might not realize is how much satisfaction there is and how truly interested people there will be in what you have to say. You've gained a powerful perspective from your education and research and a set of tools that most around the table might not have. So it's really very satisfying just on a day-to-day basis. To briefly mention my own path, of course, in academia, the first order of business was to develop a research agenda that would lead to tenure. But on the policy front, and actually starting before tenure, my first foray into the government was as a senior staff economist for the Council of Economic Advisors. I had the opportunity to cover macroeconomics, finance, some healthcare issues, even serving on Hillary Clinton's healthcare task force, where I was working on incorporating long-term care into a managed competition health framework. In any case, I would recommend the Council of Economic Advisors to any of you that are offered that opportunity. I can guarantee it would forever change your understanding of how government works and how it doesn't work. So while I was at CEA, I realized the enormous power of the federal government and, I'm sorry, the enormous power of the federal budget and its function as really central control for federal resource allocation. And I wasn't shy at all about telling my academic colleagues about that strange obsession. Providing that information to people ultimately landed me the job of chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office, whose director at the time was Dan Crippen. I'm telling you that story because I think the moral is, if you want a job in government, you might as well let people know nothing ventured, nothing gained. Well, if you do serve as the chief economist, if you're lucky, you'll be involved in all of the major initiatives of the organization that you're working in. I started out working on long-term budget pressures, helped develop micro-based models of Social Security, Medicare, and all sorts of things. And I think whatever you're working on, your satisfaction will depend enormously on your rapport with the top decision maker in that organization. And I was very fortunate to have Dan Crippen's confidence. But in any case, I became more and more concerned with a major shortcoming of the budget, which is that it's on a cash basis. Mary will, as an accountant, will appreciate this. And as such, it's really inadequate as a measure of the resources devoted to financial activities, the trillions of dollars of risky direct lending and credit guarantees and risk bearing associated with infrastructure investment, deposit insurance, mortgage guarantees, and you can go on and on. So in fact, I just want to add, there's also serious undervaluation of natural resources owned by the federal government. So all of that led me to kind of a career goal of trying to figure out how to more transparently assess the value of just about anything with a financial dimension that the government participates in. And so I went back from the Congressional Budget Office after being a chief economist there because it didn't seem worth losing tenure to continue on in that position. I went back as an associate director under Doug Elmendorf after the financial crisis. I literally begged him to allow me to take a demotion to become an associate director to start a new financial analysis division that could focus on these issues of financial measurement that I'm so passionate about. And he relented, and that group still exists. And an organization like CBO, about 50% of the employees are PhD economists, but it's very hard for them to hire good financial economists because of the large pay gap with industry. And so that's always going to be a challenge working in, I mean, something you'll really notice is in government, you'll work with people who are extremely devoted, but the average staff person isn't quite as sharp as, say, at a top university. Anyway, I'm proud to say that the work I've spent decades on has had a tangible influence on the US budget process, and some of it has recently also been taken up by the OECD. On the academic side, business schools are particularly receptive to people who have done policy work, and I think those activities have enhanced my academic status in some respects, although certainly it's eaten into my research productivity. There's also a great bonus for teaching. It creates an awareness of real world exceptions and norms for someone spending a real world expectations and norms that someone spending their career entirely in academics wouldn't have. So I hope if the right opportunity comes along for you, you take advantage of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie. Russ?
Boy, talk about three tough acts to follow. Thank you, Kathleen. My name is Russ Wermers. I am the Dean's Chair in Finance at the Robert H. Smith School, University of Maryland, Director of the Center for Financial Policy, and unfortunately, Chairman of the Finance Department here too, tongue in cheek. So I have been, I'm sure many people know, I've worked an entire career on issues in asset management, and started out with thinking about strategies used by fund managers, how well they performed, and so on. And I think at some point I really wanted there to be more there. I wanted to get into something different rather than the science and statistics of evaluating fund managers using data that's publicly available. So following the financial crisis, I got super interested in public policy and in financial policy, as many of us did, I'm sure. and the Dodd-Frank Act of 2009 stipulated that there should be something called, I believe, a National Institute of Finance, I think is how that referred to it. And this eventually, with the help of several senators, key senators and other people, turned into the Office of Financial Research. I joined the Office of Financial Research as a one-day-a-week visiting scholar from 2014 to 2018. I didn't quit. They said you can serve for 4 years and then you have to leave for a while. But I enjoyed every minute I spent at OFR, and I literally got on the metro one day a week and went downtown and met with OFR economists. I had my own hoteling office, temporary office to stay in. So many, many memories from that 4 years of 1 day per week. What have I done when I was at the OFR? What did I benefit from? Well, one thing I was working on right after the financial crisis and before I joined OFR was the run risk of money market mutual funds. And so I think my time, and I've now published 2 articles on the incidents. First of all, the financial crisis 1 week run during Lehman's default week in 2008, and then secondly in 2011, looking at what happened during the Eurozone crisis to money market funds that were invested, prime money market funds that were invested in European securities. So I've been quite fortunate to be able to publish the work that has public policy implications, and I benefited certainly, if not with the first, at least with the second publication in my time at OFR, in being able to talk to economists there about what they saw in markets. And I think I helped to shape their monitoring of money market mutual funds. And I know that the SEC, in passing its various additional regulatory regimes for money market mutual funds, did read my paper and cited it at least, something that's always very, very nice. So where did this lead me at the end of this 4 years? And what do I think of are the touch points or the most important and salient things that are useful for all of you in the audience who have varying levels of experience and are before tenure, after tenure, perhaps PhD students as well. So one of the things that I can talk about right now that I have is a new paper on the size of the hedge fund industry, and this came out of work that I was only able to do at the OFR because they have this new form PF that they have, I guess, obtained from the SEC that collects form PF. I never would have been able to write this paper with my co-author at the OFR, who's now at the Fed, Danny Barth, and others, had I not joined OFR and had that experience to be able to look at Form PF and talk about it. And by the way, this afternoon, I'm presenting that paper at University of California, Irvine, so there's tangible evidence of something great that came out of my stint at OFR. I was also able to look at repo transactions, worked with Ben Munyon, who was my PhD student. He was I think a 40% economist at OFR, and he used this to springboard to a fantastic assistant professorship of finance at Vanderbilt University. Really, the stuff that he did at OFR on repo markets was his springboard for that terrific job. Other things I've worked on, short-term investment funds. I'm still working with a former OFR economist who's now at the OCC. So I guess you can kind of tell from this. I'd like to kind of break this down into, what are the takeaways here for those of you in the audience for thinking about what it is, what are the positives of going to work for a government agency. So one thing is obvious. One thing is proprietary data, which I think I've expressed Form PF and short-term investment fund data. You can't get that data outside the halls of these agencies. That is a huge advantage for an academic, and it just isn't the same thing to co-author with somebody else who's in an agency it really is helpful to be there with them at the agency so you can look at the data, you can talk to them every day or every week like I did about what the data is saying and how to form your hypotheses. Secondly, connections. So during my time at OFR, I was able to build a lot of connections with a lot of economists at OFR and a lot of economists that were visiting OFR or were on rental, you might call it, from the SEC or from the Fed. Now I have this amazing network of friends and colleagues across government agencies. As I mentioned, an economist at OCC and I are working on this short-term investment funds project. But also, I don't want to underemphasize the value of talking, not so much at OFR, but at the SEC, the value of talking to attorneys. And I'm sure Larry can speak to that later today if he wishes. The value of speaking to enforcement attorneys and rulemaking attorneys is invaluable. The attorneys at agencies are incredibly bright and devoted, and they are the guys who think deeply through a lot of the realities of policymaking and rulemaking. And I've always learned so much from them, and I guess they learn one or two things from me once in a while, but that has been a great source of satisfaction for me. Number three, impact. You can make a huge amount of impact by doing work at an agency if it turns out well for you, like it did for myself, and I think for others on this panel. A fourth thing is just being able to spend time in situ, sitting there in the agency and interacting with economists and attorneys and so on. There's nothing like that for understanding what is hot in Washington right now and what is not. And then fifth and last is a more, I think, kind of down to earth thing, is that a lot of economists, a lot of university professors visit the various agencies to slow their tenure clock or to stop their tenure clock. A very practical thing, but I think you get a great experience by doing that. It depends on the university that you're at, whether it actually delays your clock or not, but that's been a useful avenue too. And we hired a great faculty member who spent a year at the Federal Reserve. He didn't get the job right out of his PhD that he wanted, so he went to the Federal Reserve and we hired him from there. So it's a great launching pad for a career, or a great intermediate point if you need a break or a breather. So I think that's it, Kathleen. I learned from so many people at OFR, including David Johnson, who's a career economist at OFR. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he taught me so much about the reality of rulemaking and so on. I'm looking forward to the Biden administration and how they fund research going forward.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to let everybody, if you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. I will go ahead and ask the panelists that, but I'm going to start with Mary and Larry and talk a little bit about what you think your institution would think about someone who left to go do a stint, and whether what kind of timing in their career do you think is best? Should people wait until they have tenure, or should they do as Russ says and potentially stop their clock and go visit there? If you can give us some color there, and then of course Debbie and Russ jump in whenever you feel like it.
Go ahead, Mary.
You can go ahead, Larry.
Okay. USC was extremely supportive and would be supportive of others who are interested in government service. The thinking is that you're exposed to current topics. It'll improve your research, it improves your teaching, and it just gives the institution a whole lot more credibility when you come back to say that we've had a person who was in a responsible role in government. Even if they're not at the top of the agency, or maybe if they're just working at the bottom. Coming in as a PhD economist, you're never at the bottom. But if you are just working as a journeyman, you still have access to so many ideas, you have access to data, as Russ mentioned, and it just builds you in so many different ways. So USC is very supportive and would be supportive of other people doing that. And I would add further that an additional benefit is that it can give you some perspective as to what's important in terms of doing research. Journal editors are interested in two types of things. Primarily, they're interested in knowledge that will change the world. And if you're at the nexus of where the world is being changed in the government, then for sure that's important. To a much lesser extent, they're interested in perfecting our view of the world from a scientific point of view. And that's certainly very valuable. And you won't get much support for that in government. But the bottom line is that if you can do both, you'll be extraordinarily successful. And even the science is improved by the perspectives that you can obtain through your government service. So I found the institution very, very supportive.
I think I have a very similar perspective to Larry's. I mean, Stanford is very supportive of this type of service. Either if you're going to leave for take a leave of absence, there are university leave restrictions that have to be worked around. I think it's generally 2 years. Everything I managed to do it part-time. But it had to be creative to do that, but it actually worked. And that's a sign that the university really wanted me to do what I was doing, or really valued what I wanted to do, because they worked carefully with me to try to make it happen. They worked with me when I was on the ISB, for example. I had to go to London every month for a week or two. And I was supposed to be teaching and doing all kinds of other stuff as we normally do. And Stanford worked with me to make that service feasible. I had to become a senior associate dean to do that, but it was worth it because it allowed me to do what I wanted to do. So they value it highly. It has there's just no way to overemphasize how much an experience like we're talking about here today can help inform your research, your teaching, and even your service. And as Larry said, the university cares about that. And as Deborah said, even in business schools, it's particularly important. And you can't really point to tangible rewards. It's not like you get a bonus or something if you do this, but it works. It enhances every aspect of your role as an academic, and that's where it comes through. And so I think it's highly valuable. And when to do it, I think that's a personal choice, and it depends on the opportunities that arise. As I said earlier, my opening remarks, when an opportunity presented itself to me, I tried to take advantage of it if it sounded like it would be fun. And I just tried to make it work whenever it happened. Now, some things are more or less feasible at different points in your career, but I didn't spend a lot of time trying to psych out, if you will, the whole path to tenure and post-tenure and how this is all going to fit in optimally. I thought if I did the right thing, what I thought was the right thing, and the most interesting to me, would be valuable to me in my work, it would take care, everything would take care of itself. And then the opportunities that come along today don't necessarily come along when it's optimal in your career. So you may just decide, hey, you know what, this is here today. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it work. And it all will be well. Obviously, if there's something about where you're at with your personal life, your family, or something, you can't pick up and move from California to Washington, D.C. at a particular time with much ease, then okay, you forego it. But it's timing to me was less important than taking advantage of what was trying to make work things that I thought were worth doing.
So we have an interesting question about how do the institutions that you've been associated with use research? Do they use it selectively to sort of support a policy view, or do they, and has this affected or discouraged you from doing further research or change your view about the potential impact? And before I'm going to let Debbie just to chat about that a little bit, I want to just give a personal perspective on that. And so many years ago, I left academics for personal reasons. And at the time, one of the things that went into my decision to leave was that I felt like my research was speaking only to academics and not really outside the world. That what I was showing in my research was already known by industry professionals. And therefore, I wasn't really having the kind of worldly impact that I wanted. When I returned by going back to the SEC. Chester Spat hired me there. And what I learned there was that my research, in fact, did have impact. That what I was showing in my research, and showing too, wasn't just me, was being used by the commission quite vigorously to support or do a cost-benefit analysis on both sides of the types of rulemaking that there are. And I came back with a renewed sense that research was exciting and important and did have readers and consequences outside the academic institutions and the journals that I published in. And so, that's sort of my perspective on that. I'm going to turn it over to Debbie here to give hers, but I think that at least at the SEC, they do read that's relevant to the rulemaking that's going on.
So I'll start out by 100% agreeing with Kathleen, very much my experience too. But then I want to add a few other things, which is I think sometimes we have this false sense that our research is kind of neutral and holy, and then the world takes it and twists it in their way. But my observation is that academics, like everyone else, have strong priors, and even questions that they choose to ask have political implications. So I think nothing is completely pure, and it's naive to say that you should somehow have the expectation that your work will be used in a kind of neutral way. And I understand my own biases in the questions that I choose to work on, certainly. So I'm certainly the first to sin in that case. I think very much if what you do is simply to produce research and don't kind of curate it through the political process, it will be shopped. And the people who like your message or conclusions will pick it up, and those that don't like it won't. In my own particular work, it's just been so interesting because my focus has been on accurate measurement of cost of financial obligations. And as it turned out, the Republicans tend to love what I'm proposing, and the Democrats tend to like it a lot less, because by giving a full sense of the cost of risk, it makes what the government does seem more expensive. And so people who believe that programs are already underfunded and that it's very important to bring more resources to certain things like student loans and all, they will fight against the results or the research or the ideas, and the Republicans will support it, but not because they're smarter than the Democrats, just because it fits into their worldview. So that's why, to me, it's so important to actually not just do the research, but to participate in the decision-making process when you have the opportunity, because you can try to help, as I said, curate your ideas, and also to bring to policymakers, your own research is very small and narrow, but to help people find a wide variety of research within the government where they wouldn't have time to look for it on their own. Thanks.
And can I add a quick comment? Good research makes it much easier to do what's right when the policymakers agree with you. And if the policymakers disagree with you, research makes it more difficult for them to do what they want to do. The challenge, of course, is when that happens and you're in government, you may not stay in the government very long, or you may not be permitted to do it. But the research that you do on public policy topics that's outside of government can retard foolish policy. And so it's very, very important.
So all of us on this panel have stayed involved in some way with policy making at some level. And so I want to talk about it. Assume an individual cannot go to an agency, doesn't have the time or the resources, or it's whatever, they're not going to an agency. I'll let Mary start to talk a little bit about how you can be involved in sort of these standard setting or government institutions as an outsider, and what benefits those might accrue to your research or teaching. And then Russ, you mentioned some, but maybe you could then follow that up.
Well, as I said, I've never spent full time doing any of this. I've always done it part-time. And it's not as it was a part-time job, but being from the outside, because it's easy to do, maybe it's easier to do in accounting than it is in the government service where you folks go and spend years doing full-time job. The closest I came was on the ISB, and that I was fortunate that they did have a mixture of full-time and part-time board members. And they also worked with me to say, you want to be a part-time board member, and then work with Stanford to make that all happen. But there are many, many opportunities to be involved in. I know a lot of you are not accountants on the listening in, but what the FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, or the ISB internationally, everything they do is open for comment, like the SEC and government agencies as well. So they put proposals out for comment. And so there's an opportunity to participate in either by yourself or to join with another group. For example, the American Accounting Association for many years does have a committee that responds to these documents and tries to inform it with research. I mentioned the CPA societies do the same thing. So there are ways to become involved in other organizations that indirectly tie into the standard setting process. And from there, you become someone who is known to care and hopefully makes thoughtful comments. And there are task forces and advisory groups, and there are all these ways to get involved in and around the process, not necessarily being a member of the board making the decisions, but advising the board and having an impact that way. And that is not just through comment letters, but if you serve on advisory boards, like the Financial Accounting Standards Advisory Board, for example, meets for a couple of days, well, in the pre-COVID days, a couple of days every quarter to discuss the issues that the board was facing. And you're there face to face with the people making the decisions, having an influence either verbally or through your research or whatever, to have an impact and also to learn from them. So there are many, many ways, at least in my world, to become very closely involved with the process without literally, taking time away and spending full time doing it.
I wanted to, before I answer that question, I wanted to note that there's something Mary said a few minutes ago on her prior response, is when should you join an agency or become involved? And I think Mary said it perfectly. It's when the correct opportunity arises. So it's not so much pre-tenure, post-tenure, and things like that. Obviously, you have to balance your family situation. It's not hard for me at University of Maryland. We're basically suburbs of DC. So I'm not the right person to address that. But I think it's just, when does the opportunity arise? And I think another comment that Deborah brought up was that struck me as very important, is that some of us, maybe I'm reshaping her comment, but many of us have done research for many years or for some years, and we think we know the questions that should be asked. And I think interacting, excuse me, with policymakers on both sides of the aisle gives you a much better perspective about what questions should be asked, not which questions do you think should be asked based on your PhD training and you're talking with your academic colleagues, and also just understanding the political economy of how your research is impacting things. And Deborah brought this up in great form. You need to understand both sides of the argument. So that is something that I think really benefits. So back to the question you asked me, how to get involved in agency or government research or involvement if you can't move to DC for a while or once a week or so on and so forth. I think there are a lot of opportunities there. For one, Kathleen and I have created this SEC, this joint SEC University of Maryland Lehigh conference, which brings together academics. We just closed the door to papers, and we're selecting papers. Many academic economists, by submitting to that conference, have been able to meet a lot of the staff at the SEC. So that's one of many ways. There are many conferences like that. There are OFR, there's an OFR Cleveland Fed conference. There are other SEC conferences. There are Fed conferences. I have a conference, fourth time that we're holding it with the Fed short-term funding division, where we have an open call for papers out there right now in case you have a paper along those lines. Yeah, and I think in the rulemaking, I've talked to several chief economists, or I guess a few chief economists, not several, during my days in the Washington area. And they always really encourage economists to comment on proposed rules. Comment, give them your comments. That's one way to become known and to make your research relevant, because they open proposals for comment and they're hoping to get not just a person out there who thinks they know what they're doing. They want really well-educated comments. So that's another way. And then finally, I would say look for SEC economists, junior or senior, depending on what you're interested in and who you think might resonate with. Contact them and see if you can have an ongoing discussion with them about the work that they're doing. So I'll leave it at that. I think there are just numerous potentials to get involved without actually moving to DC.
So I want maybe Debbie and Larry to talk a little bit about, they were senior leadership at their respective positions, and sort of there's a question that came in from the chat, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about coming from an academic environment. What are some of the challenges you faced in that transition to senior leadership? What you learned from that, and then a question came in is whether it's more rewarding, or what's the difference between being an economist, for example, at one of your agencies and being a visiting academic. So what are the sort of trade-offs one would make in trying to make that decision, whether maybe to go now and then wait? So I thought maybe both of you could chat a little bit about your experience in leadership and that answer that question.
I'll go first, Debbie.
I was going to let you, but I don't mind. So let me just not waste time deciding on that. So I think that being the leader of any organization, whether it's an academic research center or running a group in government or being part of the leadership of an agency, it's just a really different experience, because academia is very much about getting your voice heard and getting your ideas accepted. And maybe you have a team of colleagues who are co-authors, so you do have the sense of community. But when you're working in an agency, it's really a very multifaceted team effort. And what matters much more are your relationships and your ability to work with the people around you, and mentoring the people who you are working for, making them feel confident, giving them credit for their work. So it's very much more like being in business, I think, than trying to achieve the highest ranks of academic success. So that actually appeals to me quite a bit, and I have a sense it appeals to the other people who choose to do that kind of thing. On just the broader, so certainly it's different. So I would say just the fact that it's a very team enterprise and your ability to be effective is very multidimensional. And then the question is, what's more rewarding? That's completely personal. For me, policy jobs are like catnip. I mean, I am way happier on average, happier and sadder after a day of internal combat in a federal agency than I am as an academic working on my own. So you might say, well, why didn't you just settle down and stay on the policy track? And the answer is, it kind of came up in what other people said, but I think this is very important, which is academia is this huge privilege to say and write and speak on things that you think are important. And if you go to the government and that becomes your permanent job, you're basically at the mercy of whoever the political leadership is. And if your views don't coincide with theirs, or for any reason you don't have influence, you are just muzzled. And so I think there's value there's opt-in value, if you will, and preserving that, at least for me, turned out to be very important. So I'm actually very careful to keep a foot in both camps, and it's something to think about. But Larry,
Sure. So there's two dimensions to this question, as Debbie's already identified. There's how you relate to people above you and how you relate to the people below you. The people above you, of course, there's your peers as well. The people above you and your peers depends critically on the type of job that you have. If you have line responsibilities as opposed to staff responsibilities, it's very different. So when you have a line responsibility, there are things that you, as a leader of an organization, are charged with doing that you must do, and other people depend upon you for doing that. And that gives you a fair amount of power. If you have staff responsibility, you, like the chief economist at the SEC, although to some extent they're acquiring line responsibilities lately. But if you have staff responsibilities, you serve as an advisor to somebody else, basically, or an assistant or something like that. And your ability to get things done depends critically on their patronage. And so it's important, if you're in a staff position, to develop that patronage, or if you are not able to do so, convince your peers that you have done so. So a regular meeting with your superior is important. Even if the superior cancels the meeting regularly, if nobody else knows that, you're very powerful. And I use that trick myself. With Donaldson became chairman in the middle of my time at the SEC. He's a very nice guy, but he wasn't particularly interested in minutia. And I insisted to him that we have a regular staff meeting, but we never met. And I would tell people that, gee, I'm meeting with Bill in a couple days. I'd like to paraphrase your position to him. And they, so let me see if I've got it right. And they all of a sudden became much more responsive. So now, as far as your subordinates, you just always have to remember what it'd be like to be in their shoes. Treat them with respect, try to develop them, try not to judge them too much. Nobody likes judgment. You, of course, have to make judgment, but you don't want to make them feel pressured. The problem is that if you think tenure in academic organizations is a big influence of their character, you need to recognize that the civil service staff in government have even stronger tenure protections. And so if you push hard on somebody, they just dig in, and they'll make your life miserable. You basically have to figure out what it is that they are getting out of it, try to give them some vision for how they can enjoy their job more, and hopefully you'll write that vision so it coincides with your agenda. In some cases, they're just people that you aren't going to reach. And in those circumstances, again, try to treat them with respect, but basically don't spend a lot of time on it. It's challenging. You definitely have to go in with the understanding that you'll just do your best. You're not going to win everything. But if you are polite and people respect you, you will have a lot of influence.
Terrific. I would like to know, before we get to some more questions, a tiny, very short war story from everybody, to sort of let them know what is the most interesting thing that you worked on. So I'll start by saying the most interesting, I worked on so many things, but the thing, I saved the world because I changed the accounting for stockpiling of vaccines. I worked on the rule to do that. And so I actually feel like I had some impact, particularly during this pandemic, in being able to make the stockpiling easier just by changing the accounting rules. And so maybe you could just take a couple minutes, each of you, and talk just really quickly about some interesting aspect that you were asked to look at that you didn't ever think you would look at or wouldn't know about, that was quite unique and gave you a sense of how exciting it can be in the government. So I'll just let whoever wants to go first, and then we'll maybe ask or answer some of these questions that we have here as we move toward the end of the session.
I'll give a short response, Kathleen. As I said, I was 20% at Office of Financial Research. For those who don't know, OFR, it was created by Dodd-Frank. You're in the wake of Dodd-Frank. It's not a regulatory organization. It is an oversight organization created to kind of be an interagency, I guess, connector or collector of data, if you will, and modeling. So we were given free rein to do anything that was, I think, important for understanding the mission of OFR, which is to study issues of systemic risk. So favorite, I mean, everything I worked on was my favorite, but right now, as I mentioned, the size of the hedge fund industry, the paper I'm presenting later this afternoon at UC Irvine, is probably my most material outcome from my years there.
A lot of things popped to mind because I've had a lot of fun over my career and dealt with a lot of very interesting issues. But I think one that was important to me was when I was on the IASB, was at the time the IASB and the FASB were jointly working on the fair value measurement standard. Maybe Debbie is interested in this. We kept talking about fair value and fair value accounting, and I have a lot of research in that area, different aspects of it. And then this was what had to happen here was to write a standard to explain to people what that meant and how to estimate it. And of course, it's taking your theoretical ideas and saying that now the rubber meets the road, put it on paper to tell people how to do it. And that was a really fun project. It takes a long time. Standard testing takes a long time, but to actually have to fight through those issues to try to figure out how to explain it and make it so that people who are not that familiar with it would know what to do was actually fun. It sort of brought full circle to a lot of things that I was up to.
So maybe to follow up on that, I mean, I think what you're hearing is all of us are talking about accounting, and you might think, well, I'm a financial economist, not an accountant. But in the world of government, we don't have market prices for much of what the government does. So it's actually accounting numbers that stand in the place of what people learn from markets. And markets are so powerful that you don't need to tell people what the truth is because the markets are kind of doing it for the largely. Of course, there's mistakes. So anyway, as I'm going to give a kind of a related story anyway, and shout out to Mary for thank you. And I spent my entire career trying to figure out how to apply fair value concepts to things that are illiquid and weird because the government invents them. So it's, accounting and valuation actually should be a lot closer than they are in academia, I think. And in fact, the rubber meets the road as soon as you get into the government. So it's a very interesting place to be. My short story is, so something that comes up every 10 or 20 years is whether Social Security and Social Security-like programs should be allow people to have individual accounts, which are partly invested in the stock market. And under federal budgeting rules, because it's on a cash basis, you would essentially book an equity premium, right? Because, if you turn $1 of bonds into $1 of stocks, your expected return is higher. So you can basically close any funding gap by just taking like a highly levered position in risky securities. So the Railroad Retirement Fund was going to move toward, has in fact incorporated some private investments in what they do. Social Security hasn't. I was in a room of people from OMB and CBO, where we were basically discussing how we were going to account for the Railroad Retirement Fund. And so probably one of the greatest victories of my career was that we decided in that context, we would not book the equity premium as making the fund more solvent. So that seemed like a big contribution.
So I have so many of these stories, I can't even think of what's best. But I will note that the ones that I'm thinking of are absolutely best are the ones that I still can't talk about because of confidentiality issues. I certainly learned an awful lot of things, and well, I'd love to tell you those stories, but I still obligated not to. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story of something that I learned that would be a benefit to you. The program or the issue that I worked probably hardest on of all, and one was perhaps the least important of all. And in the end, I look back on it and I recognize that I really misallocated my resources, and I know why I did it. So the issue was following Sarbanes-Oxley, the SEC and CFTC assume joint responsibility for the regulation of narrow stock index futures contracts. And once Chicago came to us and asked to do a cash settled contracts on stock indices that were in narrow industries. The indices only had 5 stocks in them. And I looked at it and I recognized immediately that this would be subject to manipulation near the expiration. And so I said, oh, delighted to approve this, but we should have, a week before expiration, we should have position limits to minimize the potential for expiration manipulation. And I did some research with Hans Dutt, one of my colleagues there, and we determined based on other cash cash settled futures contracts that had such limits, we figured out what the appropriate limits would be for these contracts that were being proposed. And the limits were enormous because these were pretty liquid stocks. But I thought, well, look, the principle's right. Why not, for one occasion, the SEC should be on top of an issue before it becomes an issue, right? Let's do the right thing. And so this is why I fought so hard on this thing. And I fought against the CFTC, and One Chicago said that this was going to destroy their business and blah, blah, blah. Finally, I prevailed on it. And of course, the stupid thing is I knew there was no interest in these instruments to begin with. We did the right thing. There was never a manipulation. Unfortunately, like One Chicago just went, they closed down this year because the product there was just never any interest. So I did the right thing, but didn't get anywhere. So lesson learned.
All right, we just have a couple minutes, and I thought this would be a good way to sort of end. So comparing moving from one university to another, how hard is it to move from a government agency as a research professor? I think I'm the only one in this group that has done that. I think it depends on where you are in your career. The earlier you are in your career and the better your research record, the easier it is going to be for you to do that. If you require a tenured position, it's going to be much more challenging. That door really moves and swings in one direction and not in the other. I feel fortunate to have gotten my position, but it was not always easy to do that. So I thought I'd let the others who have been in academia talk a little bit more about how you would view government service if, as an applicant tries to move from their agency perhaps to your institution.
I'll just say I think it is a lot easier, as you said, to go from academia to government than in the other direction, particularly in financial related areas. And part of it is just that people have more energy to do research at a level of detail and abstraction when they're younger. I think it actually degrades a little bit your patience for that when you spend too much time in a government agency, because in the government, as in the real world, there's a huge value on simplicity, and that's actually very understandable because people have to understand a lot of things and they have almost no patience for any of the people who become academics kind of self-select into enjoying complexity and detail and care. But you can, for better or worse, the world does put a premium on simplicity, academia less so. And so I think the natural direction is to start your career, try to, if you want to be an academic, find a foothold there. Some people think they can come in later and maybe come back and teach some. And so that's great if what you want to do is teach. But I also sometimes feel bad for some of our associates who come from very high positions in industry and government, and they come back to academia as adjuncts and things, and they don't. The priesthood of academics puts a lot of value on tenure and less on these other positions, and it may or may not fit with your own psychological needs to not be very high in the hierarchy, having come from the top of government or business or something. So I think the natural direction is, if you want to be an academic, a good place to start.
The key to entering academia from government is to have participated to the greatest extent possible in academic exercises while you're in government. So if you are refereeing papers, if you are writing papers, if you're attending conferences, if you're engaged in leadership exercises within academia while you're still in the government, to the extent that you have the ability to do so, that really, really counts.
Yeah, and to build on what Larry just said, I think what we would look at University of Maryland, and I dare say the other universities here may look at this as well, is while you were at an agency, did you build world-class expertise in a particular research area that is going to benefit your university? And Kathleen, I think that you were a star, and so you found it tough, but you found a place, a great place. But I think it comes down to that. Have you developed something that we couldn't get just by hiring a rookie right out of PhD?
I guess the only thing I would add to this conversation, I agree with all of it. And I think for me personally, I had a career before academia, but the PhD program was after that career. So I went down from, fairly high up, down to the bottom again as a PhD student, and then worked my way up through academia. So I knew that academia is where I wanted to end up. And so that was one reason I was hesitant to actually leave it, because I knew that's where I wanted to be for the long term. And it was a risk that I didn't want to take.
Well, I want to thank everybody here. We may not have gotten to every single question, but I think we got to most of them. For all these great insights, everybody had a unique perspective, and I hope that the participants gained a lot of knowledge. It's unusual to have so many accomplished scholars in one place at one time, but you can see that this government experience has helped inform their research, their teaching, their policy. They run centers, they are involved still in what they do. So I encourage you to reach out to them if they can answer any other questions that you might have. Otherwise, thank you for participating, to the panelists and to attending to the participants.
And thanks very much for your leadership, Kathleen.
Agreed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
so
great.
much.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Yes.